By around 224 BC, Qin had already become the strongest power in the warring states world. Han had fallen. Zhao's capital had been taken. Wei no longer stood as an independent rival. Yet the campaign against Chu exposed a hard truth. Qin's armies were powerful, but they were not invincible. Chu was different from the states Qin had recently destroyed. Its territory was vast, its population large, its strategic depth immense. It possessed fortified cities, multiple avenues of retreat, and enough space to absorb an invasion, regroup, and strike back. According to the tradition preserved in the Shiji, an earlier Qin offensive led by Li Xin and Meng Tian suffered a serious defeat against Chu forces. The setback forced King Ying Zheng to reconsider his plan. Before the campaign, tradition says the king had asked his generals how many troops would be needed to conquer Chu. Li Xin reportedly believed about 200,000 would be enough. Wang Jian demanded a force of roughly 600,000. Ying Zheng considered the older general too cautious and gave command to Li Xin. After the defeat, the king had to reverse course. He personally went to ask Wang Jian to return. The enormous troop figures come from ancient historical tradition and should not be treated as exact military statistics. What matters is what the story emphasizes. Qin still possessed the ability to mobilize again after suffering a major failure. When Wang Jian received command, he did not rush forward seeking an immediate decisive battle. He established a secure camp, kept his soldiers well supplied, maintained training, and refused to be drawn out by Chu challenges. The army rested, ate, drilled, and waited. This patience reveals something essential about the Qin War Machine. Strength was not simply the ability to attack. It was also the ability to sustain a huge army in the field and refuse battle until conditions became favorable. Eventually, Chu forces changed position and began to move. Wang Jian attacked at the moment their formation was less secure. Later tradition connected the campaign with the defeat of the Chu commander Xiang Yan and the collapse of organized resistance. Qin had lost men, lost momentum, and been forced to change commanders. Yet the war continued. That is the central question of this documentary. What allowed a Western state to rebuild after defeat, mobilize another army, replace failed plans, and return to the battlefield until every rival kingdom had fallen? The answer was not a secret sword or a miraculous crossbow. It began more than a century earlier, when Qin transformed land, households, taxes, military merit, and law into parts of the same machinery of war on an unprecedented statewide military scale. Qin had not always been the dominant power of the warring states world. Its core territories lay in the west, beyond many of the older political centers of the Zhou realm. In earlier centuries, eastern states could regard Qin as peripheral, yet that position also offered advantages. Qin was not completely surrounded by rival great powers, could expand toward the west and south, and gradually acquired productive agricultural regions. Most importantly, its rulers were able to reshape government in ways that reduced dependence on hereditary aristocratic privilege and strengthened direct control over land, households, taxes, and military service. The reforms associated with Shangyang in the 4th century BC became central to this transformation. They tightened household registration, linked ordinary families more directly to state obligations, encouraged agriculture, reorganized administration, and weakened status based solely on birth. Rank and privilege could increasingly be connected to service and achievement. Military merit was organized into graded rewards, creating a structure in which battlefield performance could influence a man's position within society. This system should not be reduced to the popular image of every enemy head automatically producing a promotion. The rules were more complicated, changed over time, and operated within a broader administrative framework. But the principle mattered enormously. Military service could bring rank, land, privileges, and benefits for a soldier's household. The state therefore tied personal advancement to success in war and reduced, at least in part, the monopoly of hereditary elites over status. Household registration was equally important. A government preparing for large wars needed to know who could serve, where people lived, which families owed labor, how much grain could be collected, and who was responsible when orders were ignored. Administrative records gave Qin a stronger ability to identify manpower and resources. Military mobilization was connected to taxation, agriculture, legal responsibility, and local government rather than existing as a separate emergency system. That connection gave war a permanent place inside everyday administration itself. Agriculture became another weapon. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands could not survive on courage. They needed grain, salt, animals, carts, storehouses, roads, laborers, and organized supply points. Reforms designed to increase agricultural production and strengthen control over territory helped create the material base for long campaigns. Qin's advantage was not simply that it could recruit soldiers. It was that the state could feed those soldiers after they had marched far from home and keep replacing the supplies consumed during prolonged operations. This capacity became more valuable as warfare grew larger and campaigns lasted longer. An army that won one battle but exhausted its food, transport, or manpower could not easily exploit victory. Qin increasingly possessed institutions capable of sustaining military pressure beyond a single campaign season. None of this means that the other warring states remained static. Zhao, Wei, Chu, and other rivals also reformed administration, mobilized large infantry forces, used cavalry and crossbows, built fortifications, and developed stronger territorial governments. Qin did not invent every feature of late warring states' warfare. Its distinction lay in the degree to which administration, taxation, agriculture, law, military incentives, and mobilization could be made to reinforce one another over generations. The reforms identified with Shang Yang were important, but they were part of a longer process that continued before and after his career. By the time Ying Zheng began the final wars of conquest in 230 BC, he inherited more than a large army. He inherited a state that had spent generations learning how to turn households into taxpayers, taxpayers into manpower, harvests into military supply, and battlefield achievement into measurable reward. That was the foundation beneath Qin's armies. Before the crossbowmen fired, before cavalry moved, and before generals such as Wang Jian entered the field, officials had already counted people, recorded obligations, collected grain, organized transport, and transformed military service into part of the social order. The Qin War Machine began long before the battle line. The Terracotta Army provides the most vivid archaeological image of Qin military organization, but it must be used carefully. The thousands of figures, horses, chariots, and weapons buried near the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang were created for a funerary complex after the Wars of Unification. They are not a frozen battlefield from 230 BC. Even so, the pits reveal a military world containing infantry, archers and crossbowmen, cavalry, chariots, officers, and different formations. They show variety inside the army, rather than one uniform mass. The evidence is therefore most useful when read as a broad representation of military organization, weapon categories, rank, and combined arms, not as a literal copy of one army commanded during the conquest. Most warring states' armies depended heavily on infantry, and Qin was no exception. Foot soldiers could carry spears, dagger axes, and other pole weapons, swords, bows, crossbows, shields, and secondary arms. Archaeology from the mausoleum has produced bronze swords, spearheads, dagger axe heads, arrowheads, and crossbow mechanisms. This matters because it corrects the popular image of Qin as an army made almost entirely of crossbowmen. Missile troops were important, but they operated beside soldiers equipped for close combat and formation fighting. The crossbow remains one of the most recognizable weapons associated with Qin. Its mechanical trigger allowed the bow to be drawn and held without forcing the shooter to maintain the same muscular tension required by a conventional bow. In organized units, crossbows could deliver concentrated missile fire before opposing troops closed the distance. Bronze trigger mechanisms recovered from the mausoleum also show sophisticated production and administrative control. But Qin did not conquer the warring states because it invented the crossbow. Other states used crossbows as well. The greater advantage lay in the ability to manufacture weapons, provide ammunition, train men, move supplies, and replace equipment repeatedly across long campaigns. A crossbow was only useful if bolts were available, units were protected, orders reached the shooters, and new weapons could arrive when old ones failed or disappeared. Close combat weapons mattered just as much. Long spears and dagger axes allowed infantry to threaten enemies before sword range. Once formations closed or became disordered, Bronze swords offered a shorter weapon for fighting at close distance. The mausoleum weapons demonstrate high-quality bronze working, but they should not be turned into stories of secret technology. Older claims that Qin swords possessed a mysterious chromium coating far ahead of their time have been challenged by modern research emphasizing manufacturing processes and burial conditions instead. Armor also varied. Terracotta figures show soldiers wearing different forms and amounts of protection. Some display lamellar-style armor, while others appear more lightly equipped. Officers can be distinguished from ordinary troops by dress and equipment, and missile troops or cavalry required clothing that allowed greater movement. Qin military strength therefore should not be visualized as thousands of identical men wearing exactly the same armor. Standardized command and administration mattered more than visual uniformity. Cavalry had become increasingly important by the late Warring States period. Mounted troops could scout ahead of armies, carry information, protect flanks, pursue defeated enemies, attack scattered units, and exploit breakthroughs. Qin therefore possessed options beyond dense infantry formations and chariots. The presence of cavalry horses and mounted figures in the mausoleum supports the image of a mixed military system, although the proportions inside the burial pits cannot be treated as exact percentages for armies in the field. Chariots had not disappeared either. They no longer dominated warfare in the way they had during earlier centuries, but they retained military functions. Chariots could carry commanders, provide mobile platforms for battlefield control, support formations, and operate where terrain allowed. Their continued presence beside cavalry and infantry shows that Qin warfare combined old and newer forms rather than replacing one arm completely with another. Behind all these soldiers stood production and logistics. Excavated weapons suggest organized groups of craftsmen, administrative markings on some components, large-scale manufacture, and systems of supervision. This does not mean Qin operated modern industrial assembly lines with every part perfectly interchangeable. The evidence is more complex. What it does show is a state capable of coordinating craftsmen, materials, storage, inspection, and distribution on a remarkable scale. That ability connected the battlefield to the wider Qin state. Infantry needed grain, horses needed fodder, crossbowmen needed bolts, chariots needed wood, leather, wheels, animals, and repairs. Armies moving across conquered territory needed roads, transport animals, depots, officials, and labor. The weapon in a soldier's hand represented only the final stage of a much longer administrative chain. This is why the phrase Qin War Machine is useful only when it refers to the whole system. Qin soldiers did not win because every individual carried a superior weapon. They were dangerous because the state could repeatedly bring trained men, commanders, weapons, food, animals, and replacement equipment to the same front at the same time. The Terracotta Army captures the appearance of that military world after unification, but the deeper power was invisible. Records, workshops, fields, storehouses, roads, and officials. Before Qin could conquer 6 rival states, it first learned how to keep an army functioning. By 230 BC, Qin was ready to begin the final sequence of conquests. The first target was Han, a state that had been weakened by decades of pressure and warfare. Its position made it strategically important. Han stood between Qin and several eastern battlefields, and removing it opened routes for further expansion. When Han fell in 230 BC, Qin gained territory, shortened part of its frontier, and freed resources that could be directed against stronger opponents. The conquest also signaled that the final phase of the Warring States struggle had begun. Zhao was more dangerous. It had long been one of Qin's most serious military rivals and had resisted Western expansion through repeated wars. But by the late 3rd century BC, Zhao had suffered major losses of manpower, territory, and political stability. Qin pressure continued, and the final campaigns pushed toward the Zhao capital of Handan. Wang Jian played an important role in this stage of the war. His strength was not reckless aggression. He was valuable because he understood scale, timing, and the difficulty of sustaining large armies in the field. He could wait when necessary, concentrate force, and avoid wasting troops simply to produce a dramatic victory. In 228 BC, Handan fell to Qin, yet Zhao did not disappear instantly. Members of the royal house and surviving forces continued resistance farther north under the state of Dai. This distinction matters. Qin had broken Zhao's main political center, but eliminating every remaining center of resistance required additional campaigning. Next came Wei. In 225 BC, a Qin army under Wang Ben, the son of Wang Jian, attacked the Wei capital of Daliang. Historical tradition describes Qin forces using water against the city, diverting or controlling nearby waterways to weaken its defenses. Whether every detail can be reconstructed precisely or not, the episode illustrates something important about late warring states' warfare. Conquest required far more than battlefield charges. Qin armies had to besiege fortified cities, cut supply routes, move construction materials, cross rivers, dig works, manage labor, and sustain troops around enemy walls. Engineers, transport workers, administrators, and supply systems were as necessary as swordsmen and crossbowmen. When Daliang fell, Wei ceased to exist as an independent rival. By this point, Qin had torn open the political center of the warring states' world. Han was gone. Zhao's capital had fallen. Wei had been destroyed. But this chain of victories was not the result of Qin fighting every enemy at once. Its strategy depended on concentration. Qin could focus overwhelming attention on one opponent, defeat it, absorb territory, shorten exposed borders, and then redirect troops and supplies toward the next front. Every conquest changed the map in Qin's favor. Roads, grain, manpower, and administrative control from newly occupied regions could support future operations. The remaining states, meanwhile, were still separate political powers with their own interests, rivalries, calculations, and fears. They did not consistently act as one unified coalition capable of matching Qin's concentration of force across every campaign. This is why it is misleading to say that Qin simply possessed a larger army than everyone else. Numbers mattered, but the ability to place sufficient force on the decisive front mattered more. Qin could sequence its wars, shift experienced commanders, and use the resources of a growing territorial state to maintain pressure. By 225 BC, that method had transformed the balance of power. Han had fallen first. Handan had been taken. Daliang had been broken. The center of the old interstate system was collapsing one state at a time, but the greatest obstacle still remained to the south. Chu possessed enormous territory, deep reserves of manpower, multiple defensive zones, and enough strategic space to lose ground without immediately losing the war. Unlike Han or Wei, it could absorb an invasion, retreat, regroup, and counterattack across a vast region. For the first time in the final wars, Qin's momentum was about to break. Chu was the greatest remaining obstacle in Qin's final wars. Unlike Han or Wei, it controlled enormous southern territory, large reserves of manpower, and enough strategic depth to absorb losses. Its armies could retreat, regroup, and force Qin to fight across long distances. That meant harder coordination, longer supply lines, and fewer chances to end the war by taking one city. According to the tradition preserved in the Shiji, Ying Zheng asked his commanders how many troops would be required to destroy Chu. Li Xin, a younger and more aggressive general, reportedly answered that 200,000 would be enough. Wang Jian, the veteran commander, demanded roughly 600,000. The king chose Li Xin's proposal. These figures come from ancient tradition and should not be treated as verified statistics. What matters is what the story communicates. Chu required an extraordinary concentration of manpower and resources. Li Xin was not simply an incompetent commander walking into disaster. He and Meng Tian divided their forces and initially made progress, suggesting that a smaller campaign might succeed. But success created new problems. Separate Qin forces operated across wide distances, and coordination became increasingly difficult. Chu still had room to maneuver. Its armies had not been destroyed, and retreat did not mean collapse. Under Xiangyan, Chu forces avoided being eliminated during the early phase. The tradition describes them following the Qin armies, waiting for an opportunity, and then launching a powerful counterattack. The result was a major reverse for Qin. Qin units were hit hard. Camps or fortified positions were lost. The invasion stalled, and Li Xin failed to complete the conquest. For a state that had destroyed Han, broken Zhao's capital, and eliminated Wei, the defeat was a reminder that momentum did not guarantee victory. This is where the idea of the Qin War Machine becomes more important. A machine of war is not powerful because it never fails. It is powerful because defeat does not stop it. Qin could replace losses, change commanders, rebuild formations, move new supplies, and return to the same strategic objective. The failure in Chu did not destroy the state behind the army. After the defeat, Ying Zheng returned to the general he had previously considered too cautious. Tradition says the king personally went to Wang Jian and asked him to take command. Wang Jian still demanded an enormous force. This time, the king agreed. The figure of 600,000 again comes from ancient tradition, not a surviving personnel record. Even if exaggerated, it reflects the remembered scale of the second invasion and Qin's ability to assemble another massive army after failure. This was not a larger invasion, it was a rebuilt strategy after defeat. Wang Jian then did something that seems almost opposite to the popular image of Qin warfare. He refused to hurry. After entering Chu territory, he established strong camps and avoided being drawn into battle on unfavorable terms. His soldiers were kept supplied, rested, and trained. He did not respond aggressively to every challenge from the Chu army. Instead, he allowed time itself to become part of his strategy. Ancient tradition even describes Wang Jian paying attention to whether his soldiers were eating well and engaging in physical games inside camp. The point of the story is not that Qin had become passive. It is that Wang Jian wanted an army with energy, discipline, and secure supply while the confrontation continued. Xiang Yan could not force him into the battle Chu wanted. This created a contest of patience. The longer Wang Jian remained secure, the more the burden shifted toward Chu. A defending army could not wait forever without changing position, seeking supplies, or responding to wider threats. Eventually, Chu forces began to move. That was the moment Wang Jian had been waiting for. He did not attack when Chu wanted him to attack. He struck when the enemy was in transition and no longer protected by the same prepared position. Qin forces pursued and attacked, turning movement into vulnerability. Later tradition connects the decisive phase of the campaign with the defeat of Xiang Yan. Chu resistance continued for a time, but the strategic balance had changed. Qin captured the Chu king, seized major centers, and progressively dismantled the political system that had sustained the kingdom. By 223 BC, Chu had effectively been conquered. This campaign is the most important test of any claim that Qin won, simply because its armies were larger, its crossbows were better, or its generals never made mistakes. Li Xin failed. Qin lost troops. The first plan collapsed. But the state did not. It changed the commander. It changed the scale of mobilization. It changed the operational method. It maintained another huge army in the field and accepted a longer war. Wang Jian's victory was not the triumph of reckless aggression. It was the triumph of preparation, logistics, restraint, and timing. That is why Chu reveals the deepest strength of Qin more clearly than any easy victory. The greatest weapon of Qin was not invincibility, it was recovery. A rival state could defeat a Qin army. What it struggled to defeat was the system behind that army, the farms that produced grain, the officials who counted households, the workshops that replaced weapons, the roads that moved supplies, and the government that could send another general back into the field. Chu broke Qin's momentum. Qin rebuilt it. Yan could no longer reverse the strategic balance. Its most famous attempt to stop Qin was not a battlefield victory, but the assassination plot involving Jing Ke, who tried to kill King Ying Zheng. The attempt failed. Qin military pressure then intensified, and Yan's political center was defeated. Resistance continued for a time in the northeast, but by 222 BC, the remaining Yan state had been eliminated. The episode mattered, but it did not change the military reality. One more rival had been removed. Qi was now the last major state still outside Qin control. By 221 BC, the map had changed completely. Han was gone, Zhao was gone, Wei was gone, Chu had been conquered, Yan had fallen. Qi stood increasingly isolated while Qin could concentrate troops and resources in a single direction. Qin forces advanced into Qi along an approach that bypassed the strongest expected defenses. The king of Qi eventually surrendered, bringing the final sequence of conquests to an end. Why had Qin succeeded? There was no single answer. Its state-registered households, collected taxes, imposed obligations, and rewarded military service. Its agricultural base and storage systems supported long campaigns. Its armies combined mass infantry, crossbows, cavalry, siege operations, and a broad range of weapons. Its commanders included experienced figures such as Wang Jian and Wang Ben, as well as Li Xin, Meng Tian, and many others whose campaigns formed part of a larger system. Strategy mattered just as much. Qin did not need to fight every rival at maximum strength simultaneously. It could attack one state, absorb territory, shorten frontiers, move supplies forward, and redirect armies toward the next opponent. Each conquest increased Qin's resources while reducing the number of enemies able to coordinate against it. Its greatest advantage was therefore not invincibility. Qin could lose. Li Xin's defeat in Chu proved that clearly, yet defeat did not destroy the state behind the army. Qin could replace commanders, mobilize again, feed another force, produce more weapons, and return to the battlefield with a different plan. In 221 BC, after Qi surrendered, Ying Zheng adopted a new title, Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. The old interstate order had been broken, and a new imperial government began extending centralized administration across the conquered territories. Modern language often describes this as the unification of China, but the warring states world had consisted of separate territorial states with their own rulers, institutions, and military systems. What Qin created was a new political order built from conquest. Qin did not win because every soldier carried a superior crossbow. Crossbows mattered, cavalry mattered, fortifications, swords, disciplined infantry, logistics, and experienced generals mattered. But behind them stood something more powerful, a state capable of counting households, moving grain, rewarding service, replacing equipment, and rebuilding armies after failure. The true Qin War Machine was not one weapon, one general, or one battlefield formation. It was the system that could keep producing all three until no rival state remained on the map.